Welcome back to the Talks with Tani podcast. This will be our first quote-unquote official podcast where we're going to talk about history stuff. Thank you for noticing. I did get my hair done if you're joining in from YouTube. If you're listening in from Spotify or some other place that this may end up, welcome. So I have obviously had a lot of you guys come onto my page within the last sort of week when a video of me covering the events of 536 AD/CE went viral. And there was just so many questions and different debates in the comments section on this year, that it really needs to be an episode of a podcast in and of itself. So here we are. This is the episode of that short TikTok of 536 AD. So, first things first, I see a lot of comments in my comment section with people confused about the terms BC, AD, and then the other terms BCE and then CE. They're essentially interchangeable. So before Christ, BC, and then after death is obviously Christian-centered. So then historians started to use the terms before Common Era and then Common Era. They are the same date-wise. It's just a more... BCE and CE is just a bit more of an inclusive term. So if you see those things and you're a little confused, that is, that's what it is. So sometimes I'll forget and I'll use like AD, and then sometimes I'll remember and I'll use CE or whatever. So 536, we're talking AD or CE, Common Era, which means it's after the Christian Jesus time. It's after the Roman period that I'm kind of featuring at the moment on my TikTok. It's after all of that. It's post that, mid-range. It's 500 years post that change in before Common Era, or like quote-unquote ancient history into current history, right? Which is funny because 530 today, it was just not relatable, you know what I mean? But we often think about history kind of just as one big blur, and that was in the past, and so I think a lot of people probably assumed that this was taking place while the pyramids are being built and Julius Caesar is flapping himself around, but no. It's not the case. The other thing is that when I'm talking about one particular year, the Earth is still the Earth. so in my 3-minute video where I tried to summarize all the cataclysmic things that happened, it was a very Eurocentric view, because a lot of written history is Eurocentric because they kept written records, whereas a lot of other places on Earth at the time had oral traditions that we just haven't taken down, or there's just not a whole lot of information about it. That's the other thing. So a few people were like, yeah, but what about the indigenous people at this time? I wonder what they were thinking. And so do I. I wish we had year by year of Indigenous history written in a format where we could access it, but we just don't have that. Unless, and I attempt to go to the source, where in a lot of Indigenous cultures, and I know a lot of my following base, at least at the moment, is American, so when I say Indigenous, you're probably thinking Native American, but Indigenous is obviously a huge blanket term for First Peoples, right? So in Australia we have our Indigenous people here, in New Zealand, in many countries, and at least with the Indigenous communities and cultures that I'm familiar with, which is obviously I live in Australia, but I'm also part Maori, so that I know a lot about that culture, is that there's typically one keeper of history, and it's typically a very sacred job, and they will be the ones that will tell the story of their fathers in quite a comprehensive way. So I would love to get someone, I don't know, if this particular event in 536 would be captured, but I would love to get some people that are familiar with their Indigenous fathers and their what's going on this podcast. That would be incredible, so that we could really learn some history from an Indigenous point of view. Anyway, back on track. You'll start to notice very quickly that I detour a lot. I like to talk, so this is good. So basically what I was getting at is that this year happens and there were many global events, right? But we have different accounts of the events from the places that the events took place. So what I mean, and I'll just get to the crux of it, is that we had the Byzantine era. So we have Constantinople, we have sort of the fallen Rome, or falling Rome, and we have that part of the world that we have good records from. Then we have Europe, so like up from Europe as well. Sorry guys, there's a reason I'm not lecturing on geography. And then we have Africa, and we have Asia. And then we could also kind of segregate things by religion as well, because we obviously have good Jewish records, we have good Christian records, and we have good Islamic records as well. So there's a lot of ways that we can chop this up. I'm going to go probably by a place, because I think that, I don't know, it's hard with history because so much of our history is woven into religious state, right? That's how our world was ran for so many years. So anyway, I digress. So to begin, let's just talk about the extreme weather events, right? Because that's kind of where it began. They call it the volcanic winter of 536, okay? So it was, and to this day is, and hopefully remains, the most severe protracted episode of climate cooling in the last 2,000 years. So post Ice Age, it is still the most severe and rapid cooling, or quote unquote mini ice age, that we have had. And like I said in my TikTok video, the winter, the mini ice age, or whatever you want to call it, was caused by an eruption of a volcano, possibly four. So from the research that I've done, there could have been four that accounted for that much volcanic ash to be spewed into the atmosphere. So most contemporary accounts, so contemporary meaning like was there at the time, authors, like I said, from the Byzantine era, which is Constantinople, and was, sorry, no, I'm going to keep it simple. Sorry, I was going to say that that was like the Eastern Roman Empire, but let's just keep that simple. Basically, Constantinople, authors from there in the Byzantine era. And for those of you watching, like, think of, like, I can't even explain, I'm not even sure if I've got pop culture references to just point to at Byzantine era. People were drawn with really big eyes. That's the best that I've got. You'll see like art from that era. You've got like very morbid crucifixes and things like that. I can't think of anything. Anyway, we're talking about that era. Get familiar with it. So modern scholars have determined that in early 536, possibly late 535, this eruption happens. So basically, we all probably know what it looks like when a volcano erupts, and sulfate was just shot into the air, and literally stuck around and like kind of got sucked into the weather systems, so much so that it blocked out the sun, or it darkened the skies. In my TikTok video, like, they're catchy videos, right? So I say things dramatic, which aren't necessarily the case, and people love to like correct you. So I think I put in the caption, the year with no sun. That was more a saying versus like a factuality. So like contemporary sources from the time would have written that they believed that the sun would never come back because they were experiencing it at the time. And I guarantee you, if we were living through that, we 100% would be saying the same thing. We would think, like, is this permanent? What on earth is happening? Probably until we had the science to say, oh, don't worry guys, like, the ash would clear, it's gonna be fine. You know, they didn't have that. So the summer temperatures from this event fell by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius or 4.5 degrees Fahrenheit, which I know doesn't sound dramatic, but when we're talking about crops and all of that sort of stuff, it is dramatic. Like, it made it snow in China in summer, you know what I mean? Like, it's a humongous drop. And also might give some context to, like, when people talk about climate change, like, what are they even sort of talking about? Like, how many degrees are we talking? You know, how much is the earth gonna cool or heat? And I think as well, it's like important to know that this is nature, right? Planet Earth has always had climate change because we have the ice ages and things like that. And so, yeah, that's just, I don't know, something I always think about when I hear like the climate change topic come up. I wish it was more like, we need to stop polluting versus that climate change. Yeah, anyway, I'm not going to get political. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry. Anyway, back to the topic at hand. So there's this volcano that goes off. There's evidence that there's another volcanic eruption which extends it, right? So we have this one, it should, like, things are clearing up, and then we have another, and then we have another. And because of the succession of eruptions, that's theorized as to why the year was a year and not just like a couple of months, if that makes sense. So who dubbed it worst year ever? It was Michael McCormack. He is a medieval scholar, historian, and he was the one that actually coined, it was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, and if not, that particular year was the worst. And obviously when a historian says this is the worst year to live, like, that piques your interest, because why? So let's quickly talk about what evidence do we have for this? I get this a lot because people are like, you can't cite this, and I'm like, because it's on TikTok. And also, just to like keep in mind as well, guys, history is just my hobby. I'm not a historian, so if I'm going to post something on TikTok, I'm going to have a citation because I can't just know this stuff. Like, I'm not a historian by trade. So that's just a little side note. So I think I mentioned in the video, but in the Byzantine era, I cannot pronounce these names, you guys. Procopius, I don't know. you guys will correct me anyway. He recorded it, okay? So he was reporting, like, the reason he was writing was because he was writing about the wars taking place at the time. Oh my goodness, my computer's about to die. You can see I am not very, oh no. I'm not very expert at this, guys. Bear with me. Okay. So, I hope that you can just do a quick doodaloo, intermediate break, da-da-da. Pause for some music and potential stuff. Okay, hopefully I'm still recording. Oh yeah, cool. So basically he was writing journals about the war because that was his job, and obviously this goes down, and so he writes it into the history. That's the classical source that we have. In 538, so 2 years after this date, a letter was written by a Roman statesman. And so he's like reflecting on his contemporary past, just by 2 years though, so it's pretty close. And basically the description is the sun's rays were weak and they were bluish in color. So a lot of people were like, photosynthesis, this, la 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 la. Even though there was sunlight, you got to remember how much this like sulfuric ash was blocking in the color spectrum of the light as well, and like obviously crops couldn't thrive, right? At noon, no shadows from people were visible on the ground. There was no heat. Well, there was. When I say no, I mean like obviously a small amount. There was winter without storms, summer without heat, prolonged frost, and the seasons just kind of bled into one. Kind of scary to think about, to be frank. Like, imagine just a year where like no normality exists. Yeah, anyway, I think we can relate somewhat. Now, Michael the Syrian. I think I incorrectly stated in my video that Michael the Syrian was the contemporary source, or I made it appear as if I was saying that Michael the Syrian was a contemporary source. That's not the case. He came much later, so I either made a mistake or I unintentionally alluded to the wrong person. Anyway, he recorded that the sun shone feebly for a year and a half, and that was sort of about 500 years in the future. Now, in the Gaelic Irish annals, they reported bread failure, and they also reported difficulties with grains and that sort of stuff. So that confirms it sort of on the Irish front. And then we have records from Asia, like I said, and from other parts of the world. But let me keep on with the weather situation. So how can science, like how can we verify the fact? Tree ring analysis has been taken, and it shows absolutely abnormal growth for that year. So that's weird, right? And then more recently, ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica show evidence of substantial sulfate deposits, that's the solidifying evidence right there, because a lot of people were like, it was not worldwide on TikTok. But we have ice cores from Greenland, Northern Hemisphere, and Antarctica, Southern Hemisphere, both confirming the same thing. Like, both have huge sulfate deposits in that year. So yeah, it was global. Maybe there were spots where, I don't know, their weather systems were not as extreme or whatever, but whatever. So yeah, like I said, the volcano is pretty much agreed upon as the issue. people were thinking it could have been like a comet or a meteorite, but the sulfate is kind of what is supporting the volcano hypothesis. So that's that. I could go into more detail about this, but I think we kind of get the idea. Obviously, with no sunlight and colder temperatures, famine happened. And it's interesting how people reacted to the famine. Like, obviously, by the end of the year, they were starving and dying. But it's interesting because we have records of the Scandinavian rich people hoarding gold. And that's like potentially because they were sacrificing it to appease the gods, or like praying to their gods to get their son back. And then there's like mythological events like Fimbulwinter and Ragnarok, which are theorized to be based on cultural memory from the event. So a lot of people were like, this sounds like the plot from Ragnarok. I don't think I've seen... I don't think I've seen that movie. I believe that they're referring to like the Marvel movie, and I like don't remember an apocalyptic sort of volcano plot. But maybe it did happen, who knows? I have no idea. But there you go. So mythological events are theorized to be based on this year. Cool. So a book written by a guy named David Keyes, he speculates that the climate change contributed to the various developments, such as the emergence of the plague of Justinian. So that's kind of where the plague part comes in, is because this kind of was a causation of such. There was like a bit of chatter on the comment section about the exact timing of that. I was sort of taking it at a stance of, obviously this kind of was the worst year ever, and it was caused by this year, if that makes sense. Okay, also, I was just going to add, it's like funny, today we're so logical and like factual that, if there's a missing date or a citation's not correct or something along those lines, we kind of jump on it. Whereas history, and I mean, as a non-historian, I'm saying this because as historians, it's not the case, but I feel like in history, we have to be forgiving of the fact that they didn't view themselves the way that we view ourselves today. So, for example, we would date a page probably when we write a journal entry. The cultures in the past may not have done that. So we don't have exact dating, potentially. And that's why we have to come up with all these cool, like, things and scientific ways to actually verify things, because we don't have it handed to us on a platter. And we also don't have it in the exactness that we would like it today. So I was doing a lot of 1800s study in America a while ago, and it's just, they just saw things differently, and they didn't write things exactly how we would want them, so we kind of have to interpret that history and come up with most likely case scenario, right? I just wanted to throw that in because I feel like people that are kind of new to being interested in history are like, but you said this date. Which in some cases is, like, say, incorrect or correct, but in other cases, we might be talking about like a generalized span of years. Not always, of course, not always. And if any historian, if any like ancient Egypt historians are listening to this, they'll be like, lies, oh lies. But in many cases, we are talking about a range of dates. Anyway, getting on to it. Where should we go? I think what I might do, I spoke mainly of like the European Byzantine Empire sources, so I might kind of have a look more with you guys at the Asian sources that we have. And let me just pull out my notes. This is a hard thing. I was really, really nervous to do this podcast, mainly because I'm not a historian, and longer span content means that I have to do more research, and it means that there's more room for error. And I was like, so I'm not going to do a podcast because I'm scared that I'll get it wrong. And then I thought that was not a very good reason to not do a podcast. So here we are. Okay, so, and I've just distracted myself again. I've misplaced my bloody notes. So we'll go to Ireland instead. So the Annals of Ulster are where we get the records of this year. They're Irish records of medieval Ireland. And as I said, these annals, I don't know if I'm saying that right, mainly talk about bread failure, but what that meant was that their like loaves and like their yeast wouldn't rise in the climate at the time. So like their bread would literally like concave in. And like to us it's kind of like, okay, so some bread wasn't there. But back then you got to remember that like this is the core of the substance in which most people ate, you know. And I even think like the whole concept of a famine is really hard for us in modern times to completely understand how cataclysmic that is, because we have so much consumerism, and like most people haven't gone hungry a day in their life. Food has always been accessible, even for the poorer people in our societies. You know, a canned good or something can be found. And I can state that fact because it is factual that in 2021 we had the lowest record of worldwide hunger and starvation and deaths by starvation. So that is factual. You know, we're living in the most abundant time period food-wise. So it's really hard to understand how cataclysmic a famine on its own would have been. And I totally try to put myself in the shoes of like, what if you were a farmer, you know, and you're a believer. Like, let's first establish that if we're talking about Europe and a lot of other areas, we're Christian, right? Maybe not in Asia, obviously. So you kind of have this like background context that the apocalypse is going to happen. Like even back then, they believed that the world would end and Christ would come, right? So in the back of your head, you're like waiting for this cataclysmic event. The sky goes black, your crops are failing, people start dying of hunger. You're 100% freaking out thinking, this is it, guys. This is the way we go. And it's like even more profound that we survived it, to be frank. So they're my thoughts on the weather. I want to keep these episodes to half an hour. So I'm going to do a part 2 of this, and we'll talk about the Justinian plague. So this was the weather. Next part will be about the Justinian plague in more detail. Thank you for sticking with me. If you're here, I'm obsessed with you. If you like the podcast, like this is actually really difficult. I know we're all just like so used to having making a podcast is hard, especially because I don't have someone producing it for me. So if you guys don't like this content, I will stop doing it. So please let me know if you're enjoying it, because it's hard work. I have a lot of other things I suppose I could be doing, but don't get me wrong, excited that I want to talk about history. But yeah, I think I get my point across. Please tell me if you enjoy this, because I will invest in a better camera and I will get the stuff that I need to get, and maybe get a producer who knows what they're talking about or something. I don't know. If you guys love this content. So thank you so much for joining this episode, and I will see you for part 2 of 536, which will be about the bubonic plague. I mean, no, it won't. It'll be about the Justinian plague. Don't mind me. See you guys.